In Orkney, we used to have an expression, "I'll be hour with the moon," meaning that I would come and visit you when the moon is full to light my way. Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of Hour with the Moon. I'm Tom Muir, still always seem to be. And I'm sitting here in my library, but we've got a visitor and we don't have a visitor, if you ken what I mean. Because we have got a friend online and who has been in this room before in the past and will be again very soon. Delighted and absolutely honoured to welcome Sally Magnusson, who is, I'm sure you don't mind me saying that you're a bit of a legend in broadcasting in Britain. Don't want to make you sound like you're kind of fossilised here or anything.
I know, legend is quite the word, but that's very kind of you.
No, but I mean, seriously, I'd kind of forgotten. I was doing my homework a bit, and I'd forgotten about things like that. You were a presenter on the breakfast TV on Good Morning Britain back in the 80s, and so many programs that you've presented, as well as being a newsreader and an author. And
I've been around for a very long time, in other words, Tom, is what you're kindly saying.
Well, we kind of all have been, really, haven't we? But it's better than the alternative. So,
absolutely.
But so I mean, you had a very famous dad as well, of course. Don't know if you want to say anything about your dad and
my dad. Well, Magnus Magnusson. Magnus Magnusson, the proudest Icelander that ever lived outside Iceland. Although he was born in Iceland in 1930 and came, in fact, 29, I think he was born, but he came to Scotland at the age of 8 months in 1930 when his father, my grandfather Sigurstein, got a job establishing Icelandic fish for the Cooperative Society in the port of Leith as a kind of European hub, and the whole family came to Scotland at that time. And my dad, although growing up in Scotland, he claims not really to have spoken a word of English till he was about 5 and went to school, which may well be true, and I think possibly gave his English a rather beautiful kind of thoughtful elegance that sometimes comes, as with the likes of Joseph Conrad, who was a Pole, I believe, and yet wrote such immaculate English prose. I think it gave my dad's English something rather special, and a great love of words and of language, and of his Icelandic heritage, which stayed with him the whole of his life and fed into his. I mean, people know him mainly as the host of the quiz program Mastermind on the BBC for 25 years. But he was always so much more than that. He was a writer. He was a journalist. He was a translator of Old Norse, the Icelandic Sagas, and modern Icelandic works by people like Halldór Laxness. So that was the dad I knew, and the father who actually gave me in turn a great love of Iceland and its culture and its language and its heritage.
I mean, we're extremely lucky here in Orkney to have Orkney Saga, So we have an Icelandic saga about Orkney, and that was kind of where I got into sagas, through that and through Heimskringla by Snorri Sturluson, the history of the kings in Norway. But then started reading the other sagas as well, like Njal, Laxdalr, and Egil Saga. And I got them, but I never really understood them until I actually went to Iceland for the first time and seen the landscape. And then suddenly it just clicked. It all kind of made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also now that historical fiction is better understood and celebrated, and I write it myself, I think it's actually astounding to look back and see that what these medieval Icelanders, I mean, that's when the sagas were written, were writing was very very good historical fiction. It took a while for academics to realize that's what they were doing. My grandfather, for instance, belonged to the generation for whom the Icelandic sagas were virtually holy writ, that you read it and that's what happened. But, subsequent generations of academics understood the art there, that the place, the place was there, and the families were there, and the background history was there. But what was being kind of invented was the drama, was the dialogue, was often the relationships, and that makes them some of the best exemplars of historical fiction, I think, in world literature.
And amazing as well that if there's one word that really pisses me off, it's remote. That really boils my piss, Everybody would go, oh, the remote Orkney Islands, and they go, remote from where?
Well, exactly.
Not remote from me. London is remote for me, but, it depends where you are in the world. But
I've got a little riff to that effect in Music in the Dark, the novel I wrote about the clearances, when the protagonist who is in Strathcarron, way up in the Highlands, miles from Tain, and is sort of fulminating about what it means to be quote remote. And as you say, for her, London is remote, Inverness is remote, Glasgow is remote, Tain is remote. Where she is not is home. Is the centre of everything.
Yeah, I was once interviewed by a journalist from London who asked about, isolation. And I said, well, the most isolated places I've ever been has been London, has been cities, because do you know your neighbours? When you go down the street, do you recognise anybody? You're kind of on your own. You've got your circle of friends. And then there's just this immensity of strangers, people that you don't know, So to me, that's more isolating than living in a small community where you do maybe not know everybody, but you know a lot of them, and you're part of something bigger than just you, But
I think there's an insularity of thought that comes with living in a big metropolitan centre that those who live in smaller communities don't have, because they are forced by nature of their geography to look outwards. You have to look outwards. Iceland has always been a very outward looking country for the reason that it's had to be, and then that feeds into the richness, I think, of the culture. And I think Orkney, the Northern Isles, the Western Isles, they're the same. They're anything but insular.
You always had people here that either never left their parish, basically, or who travelled the world. I mean, the first known European to be buried in Australia came from the island of Flotta, Forby Sutherland. He was a sailor on the Endeavour with Captain Cook. So died of tuberculosis, I believe, and was buried in Sutherland Point. And the family never spoke about it because that was in the Botany Bay area, named by Joseph Banks because of the specimens of plants that he was gathering there. But of course became synonymous as being the place where criminals were deported to. It's a penal colony. So the family didn't want to say that he was buried in Botany Bay because everybody would then jump to the conclusion that he was actually a criminal rather than a Royal Navy sailor. But, but I digress. My mother from Westry was so wrapped up in genealogy, and she would be laying forth about this. And when I was a kid, I'd be kind of stifling a yawn. And she would say that it's important that you know who your kin are, And I said, well, unless they owe me money, then not really, not too fussed. Have changed my opinion since I was a teenager, an adolescent, but I never really got that until again I went to Iceland and you start reading the sagas. And, bears the back with no brother behind it. You got to know who your kin are because they're going to be there for you. You need them. You rely on them.
And virtually every saga begins with a genealogy, which is often quite tedious to read through, but you realize it's setting the context, and and every Icelander, perhaps also to this day, I certainly know when I was visiting Iceland as a youngster, you could be sure that every Icelander would be able to trace his genealogy right back to the foundation of Iceland itself. Quite easily, in fact. It was just taken for granted you could do it, which you can do with a small population. But it's tremendously important to know who you are, to know names, to name people, and the naming of people, the naming of your ancestors, and knowing where you belong in that line is tremendously important.
I mean, I've got many Icelandic friends who I love dearly. But the one thing that really comes across is, boy, are they proud to be Icelanders.
Yes.
They're very, very proud of their heritage, their culture. To somebody brought up in Britain, you could almost see it as being a bit of arrogance, really. But I mean, to them, it's not. It's just, no, we're proud of where we come from. If there's a problem, then it's with you, not with us. And I really respect that, actually. They're incredible people. But it is quite amazing that, for a small island on the kind of fringes of Europe, that there is this incredible medieval tradition of writing, of the sagas, at a time when writing was not necessarily being done by everybody because people weren't literate, but then you've got this whole genre of world literature coming from Iceland, which is just really quite remarkable.
The theory is that, why out of all the Scandinavian nations was it little Iceland that in which this great flowering of literature occurred? And the theory is that it's because the Vikings from Iceland, spent their time collecting slaves and women from Scotland, from the Western Isles, from Ireland, and bringing them back to Iceland. And it was the Celtic genes, the addition of Celtic storytelling, fairy DNA into the Icelandic gene pool that produced this great sort of flowering of literary endeavor, which I suppose is not ever provable, but it's a nice theory.
Yeah, and it's always kind of a bit amazing to me as well that a lot of my Icelandic friends are very proud of the fact that they can trace heritage or DNA back to Ireland or Scotland, and they're extremely proud about that. There's a friend of mine is a geneticist, and I remember hearing about the sexy ancestor, as it's termed, where you get your DNA done, and they went, well, you're kind of like 95% from the area that you live in, you're kind of 95% English, say, and then there's kind of like, there's about sort of 3% that is maybe Iberian, and there's about 1.5% that's from Central Europe, and then you've got kind of 0.2% from Scandinavia, and they go, I'm a Viking, because they select that ancestor. That's the one that they want to belong to.
Yeah.
And
because it's kind of romantic, although I'm very aware of the fact that these people who were being brought back to Iceland, by the Vikings were generally slaves, concubines, and they were not there on a package holiday.
No.
These were rough times, and it's in all of us to romanticize that era, the Viking era especially. But it was rough, tough, and not necessarily very good for women a lot of the time, I think.
No. Although I think that probably in the Viking world, certainly in Iceland, you do generally not hear a lot about women, but when you do, they're really strong, powerful.
Fierce.
Yeah, and landowners, and important people of some means. We had one here in North Ronaldsay called Ragnar, who used to take the Earl of Orkney to task every now and again. Would do something that kind of made him look foolish, put him in his place, but also made him realize that what he was arguing against was actually stupid. You can't judge him by the cover, kind of thing. And
you remember Hallgerður in Njál's Saga, who was married to Gunnar, who refused to give him a lock of her hair when his enemies were galloping towards him and his bowstring broke. And I turned to her and said, please, would you just give me a lock of your hair and I can hold out here? And she turned to him and said very coolly, I will remind you, I think, of the slap in the face you gave me once. I will not be helping you out in this particular instance. Very, very strong, scary women. Scary, a lot of them. Certainly the ones who made Saga fame.
Absolutely. And had a lot more rights than, say, Victorian women in Britain, where when you married, everything became your husband's property, including yourself. And
because I think the Icelandic women at that time could instigate a divorce, couldn't they?
Yes, as long as you called witnesses and say, I'm divorcing him, then you could do that. Because men could do it as well, but no, women could just say, right, I've had enough. I'm going, and I call witnesses that we are no longer married, and that was that. So a lot more freedom and a lot more rights than women in other areas had, and also in later times, 1,000 years later, there's still people who are basically property when they get married, which is ridiculous. But I just to kind of conclude here, I'm a bit of a saga nut, and this is kind of, I'm enjoying this.
Grist to your mill.
I was in one of my numerous visits to Iceland. I stayed with my friend Vestian Ulisson and his wife Una, and he was the director of the Magnus Magnusson Institute of Icelandic Studies at the University of Iceland. And we went there the one day. He took me and he showed me his office, and I knew some of the guys in there, like Gisli Sigurdsson, and also I was chatting to them, and then he says, come with me. So we went to this big steel door with wheels on it, like something from a James Bond film. And he starts turning these wheels and opens this immensely thick, bomb-proof door. And we go into a store that's just shelves full of manuscripts. And he says, "What can I show you?" And he pulls a book down and hands to me. So I'm looking at it and I said, "What's this?" And he said, "It's Flatty Arbok." And I went, "Okay," because they had it on display in the museum. So I thought, well, there must be a copy. So I said, "So when does this date from?" And he said, "Well, 1386, I think it was." And I went, "That's quite early for a copy." And he went, "It's not a copy. That is Flatty Arbok." And I went, "Yeah, but it's on display there." And he goes, "It's in 2 volumes. And that is the book where Orkney Saga is taken from. That's written in there." So I was holding the original manuscript of Orkney Saga. I could have bloody wept. I was also terrified when he thought, "Don't trust me with it. Here, take it." But I don't want to be the guy that dropped the book and damaged it or something, But what an honor. So he said that the President of the United States didn't get to hold it. That was George Bush had visited, but he wasn't allowed into the strong room. So
I think, he knew you would understand the significance of it and the preciousness of it.
And just, that is like one of the highlights of my life, really. And I've had quite a few. And if my kids are listening, then you are as well, obviously, darlings. But but that was just that was something else, So the whole Icelandic thing, Orkney. We're all interconnected. Icelanders appear in Orkney Saga, and there's a wonderful passage where Earl Einar Rymouth is killed by Thorkel the Fosterer, because he's going to try to kill him, so he gets in there first, smacks him on the head with a sword, he falls into the fire. His followers are sitting around stunned, and this Icelander called Harvard says, "I've never seen such a useless lot. Can't you pull the Earl out the fire?" And he hooks his curved axe around the back of his neck, pulls the body out of the fire and dumps it on the benches. And then they leg it out the back door where the guys are waiting for them, fully armed. So, yeah, it's fabulous stuff.
Hello, friends. Just a reminder of how you can support our heritage work and help it to continue. Subscribing, comments, and positive reviews from wherever you listen will help other listeners to find us too. And sharing the podcast on social media is always helpful. You might also consider purchasing Orkneyology Press books and products from our Orkneyology.com website, which is also where you can find the show notes for this podcast. All of these are a great help. And if you're able, you might consider buying us an occasional dram. This is from our Ko-fi page, and you can find it at ko-fi.com/Orkneyology. We really appreciate your encouragement in any way you give it, even if it's just sending warm thoughts our way. Thank you so much. Enjoy the podcast.
But you would have been brought up with a lot of that.
Yeah, I was. My dad was translating a lot of the sagas, so from an early age, I would hear the clack, clack, clack of his typewriter. Now, some of the time it would be writing copy for newspapers, but other times he would have. You would go into his study and his desk would have all sorts of books open around him, and he'd be wrestling with translations, which he was doing a lot of them with Herman Paulsson in Edinburgh. And a lot of that just seeps into you sort of, I think, as a child by kind of osmosis. And then later on I became interested myself, and I went to Iceland to work at the age of 19 in a university vacation to learn the language. And then I came back and I studied Icelandic at Edinburgh University under Herman. He had a course, a wonderfully timed for me, a course in modern Icelandic there at the time that fitted in with my English literature. And I began reading the sagas for myself, and sort of kind of making my own this heritage that I gradually realized had been sort of handed to me on a plate, and I've had a kind of changing relationship to it all through my life, to the extent that it's now become the raw material of my novels, or of some of them anyway, which is great too, because that gives me an excuse to delve back into not just the sagas, which are Orkney and Saga is very much the basis of the Shapeshifter's Daughter, certainly the Arcadian parts of that, but there's also the Norse myths, which my father was keen on. He tried his hand at translating some of the poetic Edda. There's the two Eddas, one of which was written by Snorri Sturluson, who you mentioned earlier, and another one actually written after Snorri, but based on an earlier source, which was called the Poetic Edda, and that's got a lot of the original stories in as well. So, my dad was very interested in all that as well, and the scholarship behind all that, and that again has crept into my own writing now.
Mm-hmm. We'll come back to that in a wee bit, but I was forgotten about the fact that you were on breakfast TV and things like that. So you went into journalism after you qualified with honours from Edinburgh University. What
joined
was that?
The Scotsman. Joined the Scotsman as a graduate trainee straight from university, and I was on the Scotsman for a couple of years, and then went to the Sunday Standard in Glasgow, which didn't last for very long, but was a very exciting new journalistic enterprise at the time. And I was there until I began to be I began to do a little bit of television on the side, and eventually was offered a job on Current Account, which was the BBC Scotland current affairs programme. And while I was doing that, I was spotted, if you like, by the producer of a new BBC network, BBC news and current affairs programme called 60 Minutes, which was replacing the old nationwide programme that you may remember.
Oh, yeah.
And so I went down that was me off to London at that point, and from then on, for many years after that, I was in London doing BBC network news programmes, starting with 60 Minutes, and then eventually Breakfast, BBC Breakfast Time it was called, and then Breakfast News it was called, and then just Breakfast. And I did that for several years before moving back up to Scotland again in the mid-90s.
What made you move back to Scotland?
I had always wanted to. I always considered that Scotland's my home, and I was sort of, venturing south for career reasons, but would always be back. And my husband, who actually comes from the north of England, he liked the idea of bringing children up in Scotland as well. So we moved at a point where, because I had 5 children, which was quite a lot, and too many to fit in our little house in Buckinghamshire after a while. So we had to move somewhere, and the thought was that it would be cheaper all round to move back to Scotland, to be near my parents and have some childcare assistance, and my husband could he's a director, and he reckoned he could work from Scotland. So we thought that was the time to do it. I had at that point, the fifth child was born up here, but it was 5 children under 10. So it was quite a handful. And my thoughts were not really on career at that point at all. It's more just, how do you get from one day to the next? Aha, where's my mother?
Survival.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's amazing. But I mean, among the early books that you wrote, I see the Flying Scotsman about Eric Liddell, who was a character that was featured in Chariots of Fire, the movie. Why did you decide to write about him?
That was my very first foray into writing a full-length book. It came out in 1981. And it was at a time when I was on the Scotsman, actually, at the time, and a friend of mine from university, who's still doing a postgraduate degree at Edinburgh, bounced into my flat one night and said, Sally, I've just heard there's this film coming out about Eric Liddell, the Scottish athlete who refused to run on a Sunday and then, won a different race from the one he had trained for. He said it's a great story, and he was possibly one of the few people who already knew Eric Liddell's story. And he said, this film is coming out. I've just been reading about it. Somebody should write a book about this. And I said, great, off you go and write it. And he said, no, I have you in mind, he said. And to cut a long story short, I found an agent very quickly, and she got me a publisher, and it was all very, very fast, which in many ways is the way I like doing things. I think if I had thought about it too much, I probably would never have got round to it. But the film was due out in about 10 weeks' time, and so the publisher said, we think we can publish it in about 6 weeks if you can deliver the copy in about 4. And I mean, I hadn't even researched it or anything, so I think if I had known more about writing books, I would never have dared to go there. But naivety is everything. So I thought it would just be like a long feature article for a newspaper. And so my sister was living with me in Edinburgh at the time. She was working in radio, and the pair of us just harried round Scotland interviewing everybody we could find who knew or had known Eric Liddell. And at that time, in the beginning of the 1980s, there were still a lot of people who remembered him, although he had died in 1945, and pieced together his story and wrote it up. And actually, we were so close to the deadline that I eventually took all my notes home, where my father set himself up as chief sub-editor, and my mother sat in the kitchen researching Japanese war techniques in China, and my little brother was making tea, and everybody sort of piled in and got the book off in time, and that became for many years actually the only biography of Eric Liddell, and it did well because it came out at the same time as the film, and it filled in the life of this man after the film ended, because the film ended with him, Olympic triumph, but actually Eric Liddell went on to become a missionary in China and achieve all sorts of other things there. So that was the beginning of my literary career, if you call it that.
A tragic end, though, for him as well.
It was. He died of a brain tumor in an internment camp in China, Japanese internment camp.
Which can't have been, well, it would have been hell in a Japanese internment camp. It would not have been pleasant. It
was, although it was a civilian internment camp rather than they weren't soldiers. There were civilians there. So although conditions were very, very harsh and difficult, they were not being, they weren't being starved and they weren't being beaten, but it was very difficult to live in live in a community there, to keep the children. There were lots and lots of children who turned there as well, to keep them occupied. And I was very moved to discover that Eric Liddell, the man who had refused to run on a Sunday for earthly glory, if you like, was eventually prevailed upon to take hockey classes with the young teenagers who were bored and beginning to kind of run amok in the camp. He played hockey with them on a Sunday to keep the peace. So he was a very, very interesting man, and probably one of the truest examples of a sort of holy man that I've ever come across.
Mm-hmm. Our little publishing company, Orkney Press, I think it was the second book that we published was by our friend David Campbell, who's a storyteller. And it was called Story Harvest. And in that, he wrote a little piece about Eric Liddell because he was a first cousin of his father's. And so he was just kind of, telling a bit of the story and the sort of connection with his own family, So, but I mean, when you're young, you take on things like that. If you stopped and thought about with experience, you would have run a mile. But
absolutely,
but you've got that courage, which comes from naivety, probably.
Yes. I don't know if courage is the right word for it, because it precisely does come from a sort of benign innocence. The courage would have come if I'd really realised what I was letting myself in for. But anyway, got it done.
Great stuff. And another one of the books which I was intrigued by, of the non-fiction ones, was Dreaming of Iceland, which was a personal sort of journey to Iceland with your father as well. And I mean, that must have been quite a personal thing for you as well.
Yes, it was. I was, but there was a wider story there as well, which I suppose justified it, if you like. I had long been fascinated by a story in our own family history, which was about the farm, really, of Laxamiri up in the north of Iceland near Húsavík, which had belonged to our family, to my great grandfather, had kind of started it up in the 18th century. And it had stayed in the family for a long time and become very wealthy on eider down and salmon. And it had been lost to the family in the early 20th century under circumstances that always seemed very kind of mysterious. And my grandmother, my father's mother, Ingibjörg, always spoke of Laxamiri as this lost idyll, and everything about Laxamiri was perfect, and she would say to me, Sally, you have Laxamiri eyes, and this was supposed to, I had no idea what that meant, but it was obviously a compliment, because it was Laxamiri, and so I started to look into this when I was older, and thought I really would like to know what happened. And so I persuaded my father to come to Iceland with me on a trip. It was only about two weeks or so, but the idea was that we would go round Iceland together, would make our way up to Laxamiri, and we would find out what happened, and separate the historical truth, if you like, from the legends and the stories that had accumulated around this. For instance, that Laxamiri had been gambled away by feckless brothers in one of the generations, and that sort of thing. And so that's what we did, and we had a lovely time together. And it was precious to me because he died not many years after that, and we hadn't had an awful lot of, very one-to-one time in our lives together, because I'm one of five, and he was away a lot when I was growing up. So it was a very, very precious time. And we drove around Iceland together, and he'd be telling me stories as we went, stories about, that hill over there, that's such and such a hill. That's, that's where the elves gather at midnight, or, whatever it might be. Or, this is where Erbygge Saga was set, and then he'd tell me the story. And as we were going, we were actually genuinely trying to penetrate this story of what happened with Laxamiri and why it was lost to the family. And we found that gambling the farm away was a bit of a misunderstanding, probably something lost in translation, but it referred to the fact actually that Laxamiri was mortgaged away by one of the brothers who wanted to buy and did in fact invest in a herring trawler at the turn of the century, when that was the thing to do. There was a big sort of expansion in fishing for Iceland, but he invested at just the point where the herring, as the herring often does, took it into its head to go away, and his investment was lost, and the house had been the kind of equity for that deal. So they lost Laxamiri at that point. So it wasn't a case of brothers sitting around playing cards and gambling Laxamiri away that way. So we told that story, and I was able to tell it in a way that actually unpacked the whole history of Iceland for people who may not have known very much about it.
We are planning a similar kind of road trip next year, because we're publishing a book by my pet Viking, Hjörleifur Helgi Steffensen, who you will find on this podcast as well. Very fine storyteller that I mentored about 21 years ago. And it'll be a collection of stories from Iceland. So it's, but going to actually see the places. I mean, Orkney is very much like that, very site specific. So to see a place that's just so enriches the story for you, Yeah. But when it comes to a family story as well, of course, that's really important. Where you come from. Another book that I've got noted down here is a rather strange one, The Life of P.
Oh, yes.
Why? I mean, it sounds absolutely fascinating, but, it's not the first thing that springs to mind.
It's utterly fascinating. What you need to understand is that for many years, when I was very trackled with both children and a job, I had this always this desire to write going on all the time, and very little opportunity to do it. And the way that I kind of slaked that thirst was to grab anything that interested me and just see what could be made of it on the sly, as it were. I would never be able to devote proper time and attention to it, but it's something that I could do for a bit of fun. And there was various books that fitted into that category. One was actually writing about the children themselves and the ups and downs of motherhood at that time. But another thing was I had been reading Finlay J. MacDonald's book Crowdy and Cream about growing up in Harris in the 1960s. And Finlay J. was actually an old pal of my father's. I used to know him well. And I was reading his book again just for the sheer joy of it, because he was a beautiful wordsmith and very funny. And I loved his tales of Harris at that time. And what he was describing was the still ubiquitous habit at that time of keeping a pea tub, as they called it, outside every croft, which guests would be invited to replenish as often as possible. And then it would be used in every stage in the making of Harris tweed, whether that was the making of the dye from the lichens and so on that were all around, or the stamping of the cloth in urine to clean off the greasy wool, or sprinkled over the woven cloth at the walking where the cloth was kind of stretched. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And it made me, I don't know why, it just made me wonder what else this product had been used for over the ages. And by dint of just some very light at first Googling, I discovered that actually Harris tweed was at the tail end of a huge industry, pan-European, and probably wider than Europe, but pan-European as far as I could discover, from Middle Ages onwards, whereby this was a product that was absolutely integral to the making of cloth, and then became integral to the alum industry. So that at one point, pea was being it was a sort of circular economy because it was being collected in London, put in a boat, carried up to the sort of Newcastle area where it was offloaded, taken to feed the alum industry, which is I can't even remember now what alum is, but it was a big industry at the time, the 19th and up to the 20th century. Then the boat would be loaded up with Newcastle coal and taken down to London again, coal offloaded and barrels of urine put in. So it was absolutely sort of central. And then I discovered all sorts of other uses for it. And then I was able to look at, how it was being mooted today, that it could be used for fertilizer. It could be used for all sorts of things if people weren't so squeamish about it. And I had great fun, and I just did it as a sort of A to Z thing. And some of it's silly, slightly silly, lighthearted, but others is actually quite well researched social history. So there you are. That's my excuse.
We had a lovely little folktale here there's two versions actually, one from Sandy, one from Stromness, both pretty much identical, of a man who was away at fishing with his, neighbours. And he was absolutely exhausted. He'd been fishing for days and days and days. And his wife said, look, you should stay at home tomorrow. Don't go out with the boat and you have a rest. And he said, I can't do that. I can't let my friends down, And so she blocked up any source of light in the house, in the windows or anything like that. She blocked up with rags so that the house was pitch dark. And then she left him sleeping because he was absolutely exhausted. And she was out working in the field, and she heard that the boat that he was due to have been on had sank and all the men had drowned. And she went up to the house to tell him the lucky escape that he'd had. And she discovered him dead on the floor because he had slipped, but in the pitch dark, he had tripped and fallen head first in the graith tub, which is the tub that you collected the pea in for the cloth. And he drowned in that because it was fated that he would drown that day. And
you can't escape your fate.
You can't escape fate.
Yeah.
So,
that's a short story, that, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. But on a kind of a lighter note as well, you've got a couple of kids' books as well of Horace the Haggis.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, Horace the Haggis fitted into that kind of period as well, when I was just writing about anything that came across my bows. And one wet Easter holiday, when I was desperately casting around for something to do with the kids that day, I said, let's imagine a story together that's set here in the countryside where we are. And I came up with Horace the Haggis. I said, well, we'll have the hero's Horace the Haggis, but you can all think of characters and let's imagine what they do, and then we'll create stories together. And so we did, and it passed the day very nicely, and then we forgot all about it. But a while later, I thought, some of these stories were quite good, and some of the characters were very, very funny. I'll see about writing it up myself, and so I did, aided and abetted. By that time, I mean, this was a few years later, and by that time the kids were older. But one of my sons in particular had always enjoyed the stories, and he, although grown up by then, he came on board with ideas, and I got three books out of it: Horace the Haggis and the Ghost Dog, and what was the third one? Horace the Haggis and the Christmas something or other. It was a Christmas book, and published by Black and White with illustrations by my husband. So it was quite a family enterprise, and it was good. But what I realized then was that if you're going to take writing for children seriously, as indeed almost any writing now, but it wasn't enough to write the books. You have to help to sell them as well, and that was starting to mean going and speaking in schools and festivals and that sort of thing. And it didn't feel as if this was the thing that all my energies, of which there weren't necessarily all that many at that time, should be going into. So I kind of let that lie. But I may go back to it.
There might be more Horace adventures in the future. Yeah. The one other book, which is, a deeply, deeply personal one for you, Where the Memories Go, about your mother and dementia. That's a very heavy and sad subject.
Yes, and it comes at a sort of fulcrum point in my writing. At the end of this period where I was writing, a bit of this and a bit of that, and all sorts of different kinds of books and kinds of ways. And before I had started writing the serious adult novels, there was this book that is probably the most important one I've ever done, because it isn't just personal. It's a huge issue for our times, dementia, and there's very, very few families who are not touched by it in some way, and it costs the country a fortune, and the treatments are not there yet, and there's a great deal of human heartbreak, which at that time when I was writing, it was published in 2014, at that time was actually a lot below the surface. People were not talking about how very, very hard it was, and how lonely it was, how difficult they were finding it. And I just began to keep a diary at that time, because I was caring for my mother. It didn't start as caring for her. It started really just as sort of observing that she was changing and that things were happening to her that I couldn't put my finger on. And I began to write, as I've always written, to both to record and to work out what I think about it, And so I was writing in that way, and I kept that for some time, and then gradually I realized that it was becoming more than that. It was becoming something wider, something for other people. It was becoming almost a campaigning document. I had begun to look into the history of Alzheimer's, into, what it was, what the genetics of the disease were, and, all that sort of thing. And in the end, after my mother died, it came together. I put it together as a book that was both a memoir of her and our life together, and a manifesto really for human dignity and for change in the way that we treat dementia.
I mean, we've spoken a lot about your dad, but I mean, your mother was a journalist as well. So, I mean,
She was. They met on the Scottish Daily Express originally, and she was a few years older than him, 5 years older than him, I think. And so and she hadn't gone to university. She'd gone straight. Her family couldn't afford for her to go to university, so she was ahead of him in the journalistic game. He was a raw recruit up from Oxford, trying to get paid a bit of lineage for writing reviews at the Edinburgh Festival for the Scottish Daily Express, and she was their star feature writer by that time, and they met there, and he always used to joke. In fact, they both used to joke that he only married her to get her job, because at that time, in the 1950s, a woman had to, when she got married, she had to leave her job. I mean, absolutely ridiculous when you think back now. Not even when she had children. She actually got married. She had to leave her job. But she continued to do freelance writing, so she didn't lose out completely. But yeah, she was a very fine journalist. She was a great writer. She was a funny writer. My father was always a bit more. He was also a beautiful writer, but more sort of academic, I suppose, in his writing style. Although that makes it sound very dry. He was never dry either. But she had a lightness of touch that could make it very funny to read, and so together, when they worked together, they produced wonderful writing.
And as a result of this, charity was you created a charity, Playlist for Life, which could you tell us a little bit about that before we go into your novels?
Yes. Playlist for Life was founded. I founded Playlist for Life the year after my mother died, and it was based on my observation during her life, and especially in the last years, of the effect that the music that she had known all her life and enjoyed singing was having on her as she progressively lost capacity. Even when she could barely string a sentence together, she could still reel off the words of a song and harmonize beautifully. And the effect of singing with her was to give her a sense, which was immediately obvious to everybody around her, that she was herself again. Maybe not for very long, but for the time that we were with her, and a bit after, usually, she would regain a lucidity, and her sense of humor and her ability to feel that she was who she thought she was, or who she thought she had been, and a feeling that had gone progressively as the disease took hold, but came back through contact with music, and not just any old music, but the music that had mattered to her in her life. And I wrote about this in the book, but after she died, and before the book was published, I looked into this question of the effect of music, and there hadn't been very much research done at the time, but what research there was showing that this was a virtually universal phenomenon. There is an impact neurologically on the brain from music that was very profound, and that was beginning to be used by a man in New York, for instance, who was going around care homes with giving out iPods to the residents and getting their playlist on the iPods. Oliver Sacks and a lady called Connie Tomeno were working in a big care facility in the Bronx, and they were introducing music. So I discovered all that, and then I looked to see whether there was anything happening in Britain, and there wasn't. So I started to talk about it myself, and gradually people began trying to give me money, and I realized I can't take your money unless I'm a charity. So you become a charity, and before you know where you are, it's snowballed into me running a third sector organization, which is hardly what I had imagined, but it's been great. And Playlist for Life now, I'm still on the board and I'm still the president, but it's run by other people. It's gone from strength to strength, and we're training care homes where we have hubs in anywhere where people gather together, like libraries and churches and all sorts of places like that. In fact, I think the Orkney libraries are involved in this, where they will supply information for anybody who wants to set up a playlist and get the benefits from it. So that's what we do. We're working in partnership with the ambulance service now and the police, and we're trying to embed personal music in welfare interventions for people with dementia. Finding also that there are real savings in medication in the care homes that work with us. Instead of just automatically giving somebody a sedative, then we'll give them their music first, and this has marvelous effects. So yeah, that all came from my mother, which has been a wonderful thing to reflect on and be reminded of.
It's a lovely legacy, yeah. I mean, music is such a strong trigger, and for anyone, if you hear a song that you loved when you were a kid, so when you haven't heard it for decades, and then suddenly you're back to being a kid again, it's just, it's fabulous. So that's an amazing thing that you've done. Well, congratulations.
Well, other people did a lot of the work.
I know, but somebody's got to come up with the idea first, and make it happen, So, not taking away anything from anyone else, but that's fabulous that you've done that, and I mean a great tribute as well to your mother. So, but anyway, then you started to write novels. I mean, the first one, the Seal Woman's Gift, is based on a real event.
Yes, sorry, I'm just shooing my husband out the room. He didn't realize I was in a podcast. Yes, Seal Woman's Gift started as, well, the publisher Two Roads, who are part of John Murray Press, published Where Memories Go, and were very keen that I would write something else after that. And my editor there said, what other stories do you want to tell? And I found myself telling her about the abduction in 1627 of 400 Icelanders from their homes round mainly the south and east of Iceland by Algerian licensed privateers, taken back to Algiers and sold into slavery. And a very few of them managed to return 10 years later, ransomed by the King of Denmark. And it was a story that had traumatized Iceland at the time, and actually was still remembered as one of the most traumatizing events in Icelandic history to this day, especially in the little Westman Islands that lost practically all their population. And I had been alerted to, I knew it vaguely, but I was alerted to it by the fact that an English translation had come out of the memoir of a pastor in the Westman Islands called Oliver Eilson, who had written an on-the-spot account of the abduction and the experience of being in the slave ship with his wife Austa and children, including the child that was born to Austa on the slave ship. Then the experience of being in a slave market in Algiers and watching his 11-year-old eldest son being the first of the hostages to be sold. Never saw him again. And I was telling my editor this, and she said, "Oh, you must write about this. This is a great story. It's a sort of reverse slavery that nobody's heard about." And I thought about it, and I said, I don't know that I've got the time or the resources really to write the kind of history that the subject requires, especially in Iceland, where it's such an important story. You can't go off half-cocked with this, and I haven't got time to spend months and months in libraries and so on. And she said, "Well, why don't you write it as fiction?" And I said, "Oh, but I don't do fiction. I'm a reporter, and I've only done non-fiction, and apart from a few, daft books about Horus the Haggis." And she said, "Well, why don't you have a bash?" And so I wrote the first draft of The Seal Woman's Gift, in which I was able to take a lot of the history, the known history, because it's well recorded in Iceland. Iceland writes everything down, Icelanders, and it's all there until they get to Algiers, when the record is not exactly silent, but it's largely silent from an Icelandic point of view, although other nations who were also abducted to there have got their diaries of the time. And at that point, I was able to imagine, or to start imagining, what life would be like for these abducted Icelanders, especially Ásta Thorsteinsdóttir, my Oliver Eilsson's wife, and my sort of chief protagonist. And I submitted that first draft, and I read it again, before it went in, and I thought, what? This is slightly boring. And then I thought, no, of course you're finding it boring, Sally, because you've lived with it so long. That must be it. And sent it off, and back came my editor saying, not exactly saying, "Sally, this is boring," but she said, you've got to inhabit the characters. And I realized that what I had done was write a documentary novel. I had written it with a view to my Icelandic historian, who had told me so much. And every second page was thinking, I hope Thorstein's seen this, and he'll appreciate that I've known that, won't he? Which is completely the wrong way around, and that for a novel, you need to start on the inside and just make sure that the history is authentic context. But you can't impose thoughts and feelings on a documentary. It has to be there to start with, and then the rest of the stuff grows from that. So I started again, which was quite a thought. Absolutely started again, and this time let myself go. More or less closed all the research books, and wrote Ásta from the inside, and Oliver from the inside as well, and the elf man. And, I allowed myself to bring in, Icelandic folk tales about the hidden people. I had a seal woman in there who kind of could see the future, and just didn't try and be Sally Magnusson, the reporter and the news presenter, but actually just make things up. And it was the beginning of the process, because that novel is still very very accurate historical fiction in terms of what is known at the time. But with each book, I was able to kind of liberate myself a little bit more, till the point where I'm in my latest book, I'm actually, writing about Asgard, the home of the gods, as if it actually exists. So I've kind of come full circle.
Well, of course it exists.
Well, yes, you and I may think so.
Do you have any excerpts from that book that you would like to read, or?
So what? The Shapeshifter's Daughter?
Yeah, the Seal Woman's Gift.
Oh, the Seal Woman's Gift. The Seal Woman's Gift. Right. Okay.
If not, it's no problem.
No, it's fine. I've got loads of books here. I can read as few as you like. what did I think might be a good... well, I mean, actually, whether this is the best one to read or not, I'm not sure. But Austa is sold, as she was historically, in fact, with two of her children into a big house in Algiers owned by a man who may or may not have been Sillaby, the wealthiest man in Algiers, but there's a possibility that he was. But nothing else is known about her time there, except that Oliver describes it as a huge house, and we also know that she was ransomed in the end by the King of Denmark, and her ransom was more than anybody else's, so that she was a very valued hostage. So on the basis of that, I imagined, because she was there for 10 years and we had to have things happening during that time, I imagined that Sillaby, who is described in the sources as being a thoughtful man who enjoyed debates with Christians, I imagined him becoming rather intrigued by this Icelandic hostage, who had her own fund of stories that she had brought with her, and the Sealman's Gift really is a book about storytelling, and about how, when everything else is lost to us, the stories in our head are what allow us to continue and remind us who we are. So this is a little bit where Sillaby, after some years, has summoned Austa to his room. So outside the door, Austa smooths her hair back nervously, realizes what she's doing, and runs her fingers through it from the back instead, returning it to what Helga once described as seeded grass. Appalled to think she almost preened for this man, she knocks on his door. The chamber is glowing with the last of the evening sun, and the expensive wall ceramics facing the window are ablaze. Mellow light is flooding the mattress of golden yellow satin that dominates the room. At the foot of this mattress, Sillaby, in a long cream kaftan, is sitting with his legs crossed, having second thoughts. What was he thinking of? The woman looks like a beggar. Is there a chance, he prickles slightly, that she's messed her hair like that deliberately? Austa, standing just inside the door and determined not to look at his face, is concentrating on his hands. They're clean and slim, rather lighter of skin than she's noticed before, with neatly paired fingernails. There's a whiff of rose water in the air. Sillaby beckons her forward with a jerk of his chin, and she drags her feet in his direction like a naughty child. She has an image of standing before her father in a similarly reluctant pose the day she pulled 6 feathers off the cockerel, and suddenly she wants to laugh. It's nerves, of course, but the tiniest snort does escape her, and this only makes her worse. Gaily she adjusts her gaze upwards. All of this, the satin quilt, the rose water, the man with the shapely nails and polished head and an embroidered dress like a woman's, all of it's ridiculous. Look at me, she feels like saying. I'm Austa Thorsteinsdottir from Iceland. I'm a mother of 4 with freckles, and I ought to be getting home. Sillaby holds his gaze to a point around her knees. This was definitely a mistake. When she piqued his attention in the harem, coolly studying him from the other side of the room as if she had the right to look, she was not chuckling to herself and snorting like a madwoman. Could she be deranged? Alma has never suggested she's mad. The worst seamstress he could have brought home if he had trawled the slave markets for a year, but not mad. I wish to lie with you, he says, patting the bed, thinking, do I? Austa notes again how formal the common tongue sounds on his lips. It gives the words a politeness he may not intend. She does not move. His eyes flicker to her face and then swiftly down again. Pray come here. Austa takes a careful breath. I have a husband, she says slowly, anxious to speak the words correctly and make her meaning clear. I do not lie with other men. It is of no concern to me how many husbands you have. Just the one. Pardon? I said, I have only one husband, and you have 2 wives, sir. She was not sure if sir was quite appropriate, but thought a signor would do no harm. What do you want with the wife of another? Austa, that is your name, I believe. You must know it is permitted in law for me to have 4 wives and as many concubines as I wish. Sillaby has an uneasy sense of being drawn into an explanation he is under no obligation to give. One day he will look back on this as the beginning. Do you know what a concubine is? Austa has not met the word in this language, but can guess. I believe there was one in the Icelander saga. She was the daughter of the King of Ireland, a slave, like me. She sees it. She catches the exact moment that interest kindles in his eye and he forgets to look at her knees. Sit down, would you, he says, less harshly than he meant to. She takes a couple of steps backwards and sinks to the floor on the furthest extremity of a lavish rug, clasping her hands coyly. Strange to admit, she's almost enjoying this. There's the same bubbling of excitement, impossible to distinguish from fear, that used to come upon her in Mosfeck, as she picked her way, stone by slippery stone, across the river when it was wild and spate. It was truly terrifying. She could fall at any moment and expect no mercy from the foaming water horses, but she had never felt more alive and on her mettle. It's my understanding, she says, feeling it time to take the initiative, that I was not purchased as a concubine. No, you were not. There, he's done it again, justifying himself when there's no need. He has a sense of having been carried up the beat on an unexpected wave. She catches the hesitation and waits. Really, a whole family of gannets could nest in those eyebrows. What is that word? Which word? Saga. Oh, it's a story, just an Icelandic word for a story. Would you like me to tell you one? He stares again. Then he shakes his head as if batting off an irritating fly, and to her astonishment lets out a rumble of laughter. Who do you think you are, woman? Scheherazade? He folds his arms. I'm right, am I not? You've been listening to Husna. She can't think what to say. Is this a crime? Persian nonsense. Pay no attention. There are better stories by far. Indeed there are, and it's Icelanders who tell them. A light collision of brows. He's beginning to look annoyed. Austa is afraid the novelty of having a slave woman answer back might be wearing thin. As indeed it is. This game, he's thinking, is going too far. Look, Signor, she says quietly, you've left me in peace thus far. Why have you called for me now? You know my husband's gone for a ransom. Well, no, that is precisely the point. Sillaby relaxes. The wave has retreated and he's on firm sand again. I see no ransom. 3 years since your husband was sent for it, free pass and all, and I've received no word from Denmark, not one. This is not a business for impatient men, but I would have expected an approach by now. 3 years is a long time to wait, you must agree. Oh, she agrees. With that, she can certainly agree. She closes her eyes for a moment. Her hands are damp. Sillaby presses home his advantage. In fact, one might conclude that either your husband or your king has forgotten me. My husband has not forgotten me. And your king, whose wars, I may inform you, are long over. Austa knows nothing about any wars, and indeed she's heard of the king, and in anything she's heard of the king came, unhelpfully, from Oddrun Pálsdóttir. My king, she fights to steady her voice. He's watching her carefully. My king must do as he sees fit, but I will not lie with you. He glares at her. You will do exactly as I command. I paid a great deal of money for you and your children. You sit there in my harem looking at me as you should not, while I'm expected to receive nothing back from my investment. And on and on. Actually, I realise that it goes on and on. But that's a little bit where the 2 sort of main characters of the book come to confront each other for the first time.
And you weave in Icelandic sagas as well into the...
Yes, because what happens after this is that, like Scheherazade, she has to figure out a way of kind of holding this man off night after night when he calls her to her room. And she begins telling Laxdæla saga. And each night she's got another chapter of Laxdala Saga to tell him. And in the process, he gets more and more intrigued. He's got lots of women anyway, and this one is providing some added interest, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. I actually have 2 rather large volumes of Icelandic sagas up there that was translated by your dad. These 2 there. He said completely pointlessly when it's actually just audio, but we can actually see each other. I can point it out, but it doesn't help you listeners back there. But never mind. So yeah, he was an important person in bringing out sagas as well. And I see from that you are carrying on that tradition as well. The next novel that you had, the Ninth Child, is also has folklore elements in it as well. Do you want to give a description of a brief piece about that?
The Ninth Child, set in the middle of the 19th century, during the building, or at the beginning of the building and through to the end of the building of the Loch Catron Waterworks, which was the great Corporation of Glasgow municipal construction that was conceived to bring fresh water to Glasgow at a time when the cholera epidemics were rife and were at last and correctly being put down to the quality of the water. And I've long been interested in the Loch Catron Waterworks. It's only about 40 minutes drive from here, and it's just such a monumental piece of engineering, very beautiful, but with a great story of human endeavour behind it. At the same time, a few miles away is Doon Hill in Aberfoyle, which is where the man known as the Fairy Minister, though he was a real life minister in the 17th century, lived and died, and his name was Reverend Robert Kirk, and he was reputed to have been stolen by the fairies one day on his perambulations up Doon Hill. And the book, in the way that I had slightly done in Sealwoman's Gift with the bringing in the hidden people, the Ninth Child takes that on and sort of blends together this Robert Kirk character who was taken by the fairies in the 17th century but re-emerges in the 19th century during the building of the waterworks. And it's sort of, I was interested to see if I could blend social and historical realism with folklore. And so that's what I do there.
Huh. Do you have any excerpts from it that you would like to share as well? Or
excerpts from the Ninth Child? Mm-hmm. Certainly. I'll try not to witter on so long as the last time, but I think the thing to do with this is it's got three sort of narrative voices. One is the third person, conventional third person narrator. The second one is inside the head, the mind of Robert Kirk, the fairy minister returned. And the third one is the voice of Kirsty McEachern, who's actually based on my great grandmother from the Isle of Mull. She's come down, as so many of the Highlanders did, come down with her husband to find work, and he's found work as a navvy on Loch Catron Waterworks. So I'll read a bit of this. So the first chapter is this. Alexander should have warned her. Explosions, Izzy, he might have said. Puddles, he could have mentioned. Grass of a less manicured variety than the Botanic Gardens. Pronounced absence of paths wider than your dress. A hint would have been helpful. Had he warned her? This morning's compliment on the strawberry bonnet had been on reflection a shade less than sincere, but no, nothing had been said. She would have paid attention to that much. Isabel sank majestically onto a hummock of grass, which is the only way a descent from the upright can be accomplished in a crinoline, and looked around. There were men everywhere, navvies distinguishable by their gay neckerchiefs and hobnail boots, sauntering about with armfuls of ironmongery, or leading the most enormous horses along the shore. Gentlemen guests whooping themselves hoarse around a vast corporation of Glasgow banner, each boom accompanied by a frenzied waving of hats. By now, Alexander would probably be hollering right along with them. As the only lady for miles, and certainly the only woman braving the wilds today in a hooped lilac gown and a bonnet nodding with silken fruit, Isabel had been attracting so much attention that she barely noticed the other figure staring at her from a clump of bright trees. She might not have registered him at all. Black coat, something white at the neck, no hat of any kind, if she'd not been so struck by the man's eyes, which burned through the faint gunpowder haze with a peculiar energy. Hungry is how she would describe the look afterwards. Poor fellow, her husband would murmur, we need to find him work. Alexander was not easily engaged with the metaphor. The man was quickly gone, and Isabel, hot and disgruntled in her billow of skirts, had no more inkling of peril than a twinge of anxiety for her strawberries. There was certainly nothing to alert her that here on the banks of hidden Loch Eoin was a beginning, or that this sunny May morning would forever remain for her a kind of ending too. And then the second one in the voice, as we discover later, of Robert Kirk. Out, out, I am out. The earth erupting in thunder and fire. Out. Smoke drifting across the heavens. Out. A lady, attired in a fine gown and egregiously silly bonnet. Aye, I hear you, I see her. Robert Kirk is out of fairy, and one glance is enough. And then the third voice of Kirsty MacEachern. We don't know until the very end who she's talking to. Just start at the beginning, you say. Tell it your own way, Kirsty MacEachern, and forget who's listening. But see, beginnings, endings. It's not always so easy to know which is which. Life's a circular sort of thing most of the time, and so is a story. Those of us at the heart of this one would likely all tell you differently where it began. And as for where it ended, well, is it even finished yet? That's what I ask myself sometimes. It's a long while since I've spoken about Robert Kirk, but maybe it's time. Maybe it's time right enough. I'm the one who knew Isabel Aird best in those years, unless you're counting her husband, and there were times I wasn't so sure you should. And I'm the one who warned her, Mrs. Aird says I be careful. I've got a feeling about this man. I get these feelings. When you grow up in the Highlands and Islands with Gaelic your first tongue, you come away with an instinct for things that are a bit beyond what you might call the natural, though to us it's all one. You see what canna exactly be seen in the names our ancestors gave to the hills and the hollows and the brown peat moors and the ancient mounds of the Sheathachan. That's fairies to you. English never quite catches the idea of any of it. Nor, to be honest with you, did Isabel Aird. You have to remember she was a lowlander, born and bred in a city. What did she know about matters that Highlanders drink in with their mother's milk? She thought they were no more than a quaint thing to read about in those fancy books that brought tourists to ooh and ah at the landscape of the Trossachs. There she came, all innocent, with her parasol a twirl and a background that had bred her useless. Broken inside, though. Awful broken. A woman like that has no defences. There you are. Nice trials.
Intriguing stuff. Love it. Your third novel, Music in the Dark, I mean, you mentioned there about great-grandmother from Mull, and this is about Highland clearances, and I believe that's something that touched your family as well. Your mother's
Yes,
family.
well, the great-grandmother that Kirsty MacEachern there was based on lightly was, she grew up in Mull, and I researched her genealogy many years ago because my mother used to tell stories about her, and I discovered that, I kind of validated validated the stories and, was able to put names and dates to what happened to her. And she was in a township called Ardmore near Tobermory, which was cleared in 1918. Let's see which book I'm on here. 1863. And she and her sisters had to come to Glasgow to find work. She was only a girl of 13 at the time. Her mother went into the Tobermory poorhouse. The whole community was no more. And she came down to Glasgow. She got work in a big house. She got married. She had children, 3 of whom died of TB. And she, towards the end of her life, living alone in Rutherglen, across the Clyde, where I was eventually born and raised myself. While living there alone, she took in washing to make her ends meet, and she eventually took in a lodger. And that story of the lodger is what became the trigger for Music in the Dark, which explores a different clearance story which had also interested me at a different time, was the clearance of Strathcarron, the community of Greenyards in 1853, which was just 10 years before my mother's story. And that was it was one of the last big confrontations of the Highland clearances, which was between the women of the township and the police who'd been sent from Tain and Inverness to come and make sure that the eviction notices were delivered. And I was interested in that. I was interested in the fact that the women, ganged up to try and prevent the delivery of the notices, which on investigation was something that actually they did in a lot of these Highland townships, which we hadn't really known about. It's very much underreported. And in the end, what I've done is have a heroine, Jamesina Ross, who's based on one of these women, known women, and spliced her story when she is cleared, evicted from Greenyards. Her story in Glasgow picks up the story of my great grandmother. If you're wanting a wee bit of that,
yes,
there's a bit where it all takes place over one night in a Glasgow tenement, and we gradually discover it's her and the lodger, who are now fairly recently married, and he is trying to help her with the fact that her mind is beginning to kind of fracture after the violence that she suffered 30 years before. So where have we got to? So this is her sort of thinking back to that night, or that day rather, that dawn, when the policeman arrived. The light was growing rosier over Fiarnach Field. It was the third time they'd gathered to resist the summonses, but the atmosphere this morning was tenser, with none of the usual banter and bravado. The whistling that summoned them had been clamorous. Not just 1 or 2 sheriff's men, but dozens of police constables had been seen spilling drunkenly out of their carriages at the point where the road from Ardguy gave out, and anyone pressing forward must do it on foot. Now the lookouts were streaming back and had been told to keep out of the way. Sounds from the trees, brushed leaves, the crack of twigs, careless feet approaching. She's back there again, a horde of black uniforms looming out of the grey wood and lining up in untidy rows before them, shock at how many there were up close. A man at the front shouting that he was the sheriff, and they had to clear the way so that his officer could serve lawful summonses of removal on the tenants. Kirsty Ross, bustling forward to show the sheriff some letter she had that proved, so she was shouting that the removal had not been authorised. Batons raining on Kirsty's head, her own breath buckling at the sight of it. Kirsty's cap shredded, blood all over, women screaming as she goes down, Big Anne bellowing, Big Anne on the ground, policemen hitting out, women scattering. She's running too. Grace in front of her. Screams everywhere, roars everywhere, policemen everywhere, flailing arms in uniforms. Grace falling. Don't touch her. Don't you touch my Grace. She's pummeling a policeman with her fists. She's trying to get Grace to wake up. She's shaking her shoulders. Wake up, Grace. Wake up. Foskel de Hulen. Please, open your eyes. There, that'll do for that one. I'm sorry about the interruption of a...
Oh, that's okay.
WhatsApp.
I mean, the
Notice
clearances were just such a traumatic period in Scots history. I mean, it's...
Absolutely. And I'm not sure that many people know too much about them now. I think I might be the last generation, maybe yours, that learned about them at school.
I didn't really do school, but
oh well, fair enough.
The way that I was introduced to it was actually on Play for Today on BBC Two, the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Black Oil.
Oh yes,
very, very powerful theatre company production, which toured Scotland, came to Orkney as well, actually. But it was the only Play for Today, I was told later, because it was like 1971, so I'd have been about 8. And I was told then, or I read later, that the Heath government, the Tory government under Ted Heath, had told the BBC that they were not to repeat it, because Play for Today's were regularly repeated. But that one, was stopped, was censored, because it was just, it was a truth that they didn't want to face, so. But
yeah,
moving.
As with many truths, indeed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's nothing more uncomfortable than the truth. Moving along, so, to the new novel, The Shapeshifter's Daughter, which I've had the great privilege to have read, before it's actually...
At a very early stage, too. You were very, very, very helpful in mentoring me on all things Orcadian.
Well, I don't know about that, but it's a fabulous story. I absolutely love it, and we'll be together when this is broadcast. We'll be together tomorrow night, 6th of November, because the full moon's on the 5th. Be at Stromness Library for the launch of the book. It's being launched in Orkney. And so really... Where else?
Because it's all set in Orkney, with the slight exception of Asgard and the Underworld.
Oh, but Asgard's in the North Isles. Did you not know?
Oh, is that where it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's a little annex of Sandy. So, So, I mean, why, again, I suppose, with, it's saying why choose that as a subject is, we've really covered that, basically. You're steeped in the lore of, Nordic lore, as in the mythology. So would you like to sort of summarize a bit of what the book is about?
The book is basically a reimagining of the Norse myth of hell, of the underworld, who fetches up in modern Orkney, where she connects with the person who in the book becomes a sort of alter ego, who is a woman called Helen, who grew up in Stromness and then went away for reasons that are unpacked in the course of the novel, and then came back to die. She's in her mid-50s, and she has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, which makes it sound a rather dark novel. I don't think it is particularly dark, but I wanted to not shy away from examining since I'm taking the central figure of hell, who is the queen of death, if you like, in the Norse myths. And the Norse myths, as all myths, have evolved to tell us about ourselves, to help us examine the human condition. It felt that I needed to take death seriously as well, but see how in the course of the book it could be looked at through a lens of the joy of making the most of life, rather than the unavoidable sadness of death itself. So that's the kind of interplay that I'm setting up in the novel, and the reason I chose hell really was that I love myths, and I've loved the modern take on many of the Greek myths, which is becoming quite popular now, and Madeline Miller's Circe is the most marvelous book. But it seemed to me that not enough, although one or two things have been done with the Norse myths, not very much. Neil Gaiman's retelling is exhilarating, but it's very much a straightforward retelling of the myths as we find them in the two Eddas. I quite like the idea of taking one of these myths and looking at it askance, looking at it from a different, viewpoint. And hell is so kind of sensational, the way that she's drawn. She's depicted as half crone and half youthful beauty, and as terrifying in a sort of over the top manner when Snorri Sturluson gets going. It's all kind of dripping snake venom, and it's too much. It's too theatrical. And I thought how interesting it would be if you just told her story through her own eyes, thrown into the underworld by Odin, the head of the gods, while her siblings had other fates, all because Odin had visions of the future in which the children of Loki, including Hel, were responsible for the downfall of the gods in the end, and so he had to neutralize them, basically. But I wanted to tell that story from her eyes, which, with one fell swoop, transfers our sympathies, really, I think, to Hel and away from Odin, who has normally been the center of the, wise Odin, doing his best to save the gods, to this rather malign character.
Yeah. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, though, because the fact that they treated them the way that they did was it guaranteed that is what the fate would be. Maybe
Yes.
if they'd been kind of left alone, they might have been a bit of a nuisance, but not the great destruction of the main gods as they turn out.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I mean, it's a real tragedy from the gods' point of view. But I just, I thought it was an interesting tweak to see it from Hel's point of view, and actually to look at Hel, the figure of Hel, in pre-Christian tellings of her story, where she is not the hideous and terrible goddess who brings death, but actually the goddess of birth, really, of new beginnings, if you like, the midwife of death, rather than the harbinger of the horrors of death.
Mm-hmm. The one thing which I really took from it, and it's something that I actually must thank you for, is that you read the myths, and it's very straightforward. Loki goes off, fathers 3 monsters on a giantess. And they're always depicted as the monstrous offspring of Loki. So your sympathies are completely wiped out at the beginning. There are no sympathies for them. They're monstrous, and that's how they're always depicted. And the eldest Fenrir or Fenris, the wolf, who will kill Odin. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, that will kill Thor. And then Hel, half beautiful woman and half corpse, and the way that they're portrayed is that they are pure evil. Their father's Loki. How can they be anything other than that? What you did, though, was to depict them as children who couldn't help how they looked or what they were. They didn't ask to be born, and then they're taken away by the gods, and they trust them to start with, but then they're betrayed, and that's such a different way of looking at it that it makes me want to go back to the Edda again and to reevaluate other stories as well and think, well, okay, this is from very much a blokish point of view, but what else can we take from this? But I think
it's fascinating, and I'd like to do that with other characters myself. Next to because it's a very male world, even more so than the Greek myths, I think. And I think the suggestion as I read the the academics is that there have been better fleshed out female characters in the past, but we've lost them. We've lost them, and the ones who've survived into the public imagination to this day are Odin and Thor and Loki, primarily these three who just have dominated everything. And then you've got beautiful wives in the background, but that's about all. Which is why I suppose why my imagination fixed on Hel, who is who is not a beautiful golden wife in any sense.
No, but you really feel for her, and reading of your depiction of her living in Orkney, I could imagine, so quite a few years ago now, I could imagine me and her sitting down, having a glass of absinthe and listening to Bauhaus. She comes across as a bit of a goth,
She does, yes, yeah. That's a wonderful picture. I'll dwell on that. You and her.
I don't do absinthe anymore. I had an unfortunate experience once. But anyway, would you like to share a little bit of the story? And this is an exclusive because this isn't published until tomorrow. So
that's right. Okay. Well, I think maybe I'll start at the beginning. There's a prologue, but after that, the first chapter, each chapter takes place in a part of the Norse realm. So whether it's Utgard or Midgard, which is where the humans live, or Asgard, where the gods live. So we start in Utgard. Imagine once upon a time a girl. She lives in a place of wild winds and bald mountains, jagged sea cliffs and pitted lava fields. Its name is Utgard. With myth's unerring eye for the sensational, the only personal detail that will be recorded about this young woman is her face. This face, as will be agreed by everyone she later encounters, is extraordinary. One side is lustrously, sparklingly, youthfully radiant, the other so discoloured that one day, once the myth makers have got into their stride, it will be likened to the dark blue hue of a corpse. The girl has not seen her face, nor in the innocent family time she's enjoying as our own story begins, has her attention been directed to it by anyone else. The girl lives with her mother and younger brother and sister in the land of the frost giants, which is part of Utgard. She and her siblings are not frost giants themselves. Each is something else entirely, for which state of affairs their father, his antecedents decidedly murky, is not considered blameless. But their mother is a frost giant, and proud of it. Utgard is the outside place, as its Norse name exactly describes. It lies on the periphery of what the wider world, by which is meant Asgard, considers civilization, although this is one point among many that the girl will have cause to query. Utgard lies beyond and to the east of lofty Asgard, where the gods live, and Midgard, the Middle-earth, where humans have made their home. The way these regions connect can be visualized as a world tree, with its foliage in the heavens, its branches enfolding those three regions, which in a sense are whole worlds in themselves, and one of its roots extending deep down, deep, deep down, into the icy horrors of Niflheim. The world tree means little to the girl. The only trees she sees or can imagine are the frail birches of Utgard that spring up here and there on the stony plains, smelling faintly of fruit after a rinsing of rain, shedding their leaves as soon as winter stirs, and never within a wind's whisper of reaching the sky. And that chapter goes on to give us some of the background to the mythology of the creation of the world in Utgard. And then we move on to Midgard and the parallel story. Helen Firth steps out of Kirkwall Airport into a blast of cold rain. She hunts up and down the row of hire cars, hauls her case into the boot, drops the keys, fishes for them in a puddle, fails to locate the heater, wrestles with the sat-nav, gives up on both, stares through the winter afternoon's gloom at the scattered lights of Orkney's mainland, and listens grimly to the thrum of rain on windscreen. What has she done? What has she gone and done? When an impulsive person makes an impulsive decision, regret can in general be borne with equanimity. Experience suggests you win some, you lose some, and another impulsive decision will more than likely sort everything out. When a self-contained overthinker of middle years, solitary disposition, and careful habits, a woman who can spend 5 minutes agonizing over which recycling bin to place the cranberry juice carton in, suddenly makes a wild and outrageous decision, the flood of regrets can be unstoppable. Within days, possibly even hours, of stalking out of the consultant's office and placing her house on the market, Helen was regretting it. But reversing the decision, easy enough, your impulsive person might airily insist, itself proved an impulse too far. So here she is, flopped over a steering wheel in an empty island airport in a storm of recrimination at her own folly. The cold stealing up from her feet encourages her to move at last. Gingerly, she inches the car onto unfamiliar roads, heading vaguely in the direction of a coastline into which the twilit sea is already smudging. After asking directions of the only human still loitering on the outskirts of Kirkwall at 4:30 p.m. on a Saturday, she finally turns off the main road, bounces along a potholed track, and pulls up at the end of a terrace of small houses overlooking Scapa Flow. Water and land have so thoroughly merged into murk that only the gleam of orange pier lights hints at the presence of the sea at all. So that's a wee flavour of the beginning of Shapeshifter's daughter. They are both, of course, the daughter of shapeshifters.
And I can highly recommend this to anyone that likes a good read, especially anyone that's interested in stories and in folk, in mythology as well, Nordic mythology. It's a fabulous story, beautifully written, and like I said, that brings humanity, if that is the right word, into the realm of the gods, where you actually empathize with this character, Hel, who has always been depicted as a hideous creature, a monstrous creature, residing over the land of the dead. And here we can see her as how she was when she was a child as well, and missing her mother and wishing that she was back home, and just trying to escape and find a bit of peace. It's very, very well put together and cleverly done. And I don't.
Well, thank you again for your help and your guidance in keeping me right. When you got a manuscript at an early stage, you were very encouraging. So thank you.
No, it's a great one, but and of course, like I said, tomorrow, the 6th of November, at 7:30, we will be at the Stromness Library, where part of the story is set. And I'll be doing a question and answer thing with yourself. And it's an absolute pleasure if you survive my cooking first.
Oh, yes. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, say that in a
I'll
month.
have to not lay into the wine too much if I'm going to be able to string a couple of words together.
You can come by afterwards and we can get stewed into the
Finish
wine.
it off.
Yeah, absolutely. But Sally, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time. I know you're an incredibly busy woman, and it's really kind of you to do this. And it's been an absolute pleasure. I could sit here and talk for a lot longer, and no doubt will do on the sex. But meanwhile, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Tom.
Right. And we'll see everybody else in another month's time when they'll be doing something else, Hour with the Moon. But from now, Sally Magnusson, thank you very much. And good night to you and to everyone else.